I heard breathing in my room, but I was alone. Woke up to the sound of breathing, not the safe, familiar rhythm of my own. This was harsher, uneven, almost wet. The sort of sound you hear when someone is trying to catch their breath after running. But there was a subtle whistle at the end of each exhale that made my skin prickle. For the first few seconds, I couldn't tell where it was coming from. My brain, still fogged from sleep, tried to put it into something ordinary. Maybe the wind pressing against the siding or the old heating system kicking in. But as I became more awake, it became horribly clear. The sound wasn't coming from outside the house. It was in the room. My room. I didn't move. I barely even blinked. Something inside me, ancient and wordless, told me to stay absolutely still, like prey that's just heard the rustle of a predator in the grass. I let my breath slow until I could almost hear the blood rushing in my ears. But the other breathing didn't match mine. Whoever it was, whatever it was close enough that I could hear the wet click of their tongue as they swallowed. Every inhale seemed to suck the air a little thinner, as though they were drawing it right out of the room. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, but when I held my own breath entirely, the sound continued, steady and undeniable. It was coming from my left, from the side of the bed where no one should be. I tried to think rationally. My door was locked. My windows were latched. But fear has a way of making logic collapse in on itself. I felt my fingers twitch toward my phone on the nightstand, but I stopped. Moving meant making noise. And making noise meant what? A reaction? The breathing shifted slightly, closer. I could almost feel the warmth of it on my cheek. Then, without warning, it stopped. The sudden absence of it was almost worse. Silence like that shouldn't exist in a house at night. There should have been the tick of the clock, the creak of settling wood, the faint hum of the fridge downstairs. But it was as if the entire house had gone still to listen. And in that stillness, I realized something that chilled me more than the breathing itself. I couldn't hear them leaving. No retreating footsteps. No soft brush of fabric moving away. It was as if they had dissolved into the darkness. I swallowed hard and, against every screaming instinct, whispered into the black. "Hello." The word felt small, swallowed by the dark before it reached anything. No answer. I waited. My eyes scanned the shadows, trying to force them into familiar shapes. The dresser, the chair, the pile of clothes I never got around to folding. Everything was exactly where it should be. Except, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been right there, inches from my face, watching me. The thing is, I live alone. It's a 2-story house at the very end of a dead-end street that most people in town barely know exists. Realtors have called it secluded and full of character, which is a polite way of saying far away from anyone who might hear you scream. During the day, it's almost picturesque, sunlight filtering through tall oaks, paint chip siding that gives it that rustic, vintage charm. But at night, the quiet turns heavy. There's no faint traffic hum in the distance, no neon glow from nearby shops. Out here, darkness isn't a shade, it's a substance. It presses against the windows. When I first moved in, I thought it would be peaceful, and for a while it was. The only sound were my own footsteps on the creaky floors, the sigh of the wind in the trees, and sometimes the distant bark of a dog. But over the last week, the house had started to change. It was nothing dramatic at first, little things. The first time I noticed something wrong was a Tuesday night. I was in the living room reading when the ceiling light began to flicker. Not in a random, one-off way that happens before a bulb burns out. This was rhythmic, almost deliberate. The shadows on the wall shifted and stretched in time with the flicker. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure in the darkened TV screen, not standing, but leaning forward as if peering at me. The air grew colder, enough that I could see my own breath in short, uneven puffs. I set my book down, trying not to let my heartbeat dictate my pace as I walked to check the breaker. Everything looked fine. When I returned to the living room, the flickering had stopped. The shadows had gone back to normal. I told myself it was nothing, maybe faulty wiring. But deep down, I didn't believe it. 2 nights later, the sound started. It was past midnight, and I was scrolling through my phone in bed when I heard a faint knocking from downstairs. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. A pause. Then 3 more. I froze. It wasn't random enough to be the house settling. And then came the scraping. It was long, slow, and deliberate, like fingernails dragging across the front door. The sound made the hair on my arms stand up. I grabbed the heavy flashlight from my nightstand and began creeping toward the stairs. Every step I took seemed to groan louder than usual, betraying me. When I reached the living room, the scraping stopped. I stood there, staring at the door, barely breathing. Then, on impulse, I switched on the porch light. Nothing. No one was there. But as I turned to close the door, my stomach dropped. There was a muddy handprint smeared across the glass panel. It was big, much bigger than mine, and the fingers were far too long. The next night, I woke up to what sounded like rain. It was steady, soft, like hundreds of tiny fingertips tapping against the roof. But when I checked the window, the sky was clear. The sound wasn't coming from above. It was coming from the attic. That tapping from the attic didn't stop. It wasn't frantic. It was patient. A steady, rhythmic sound, as though someone up there was calmly testing the wood, one fingertip at a time. I lay frozen in bed, staring at the ceiling. The sound wasn't loud, but it was present, threading its way into my nerves like a splinter. Each tap seemed to carry more weight than the last, until it felt like it was knocking directly inside my skull. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a squirrel, or a raccoon that had found its way into the crawl space. But the longer I listened, the less it sounded like claws or paws. There was no scurrying, no irregular patter, only those deliberate, human-like taps. And then, just when I thought it might stop, I heard the shift. It was subtle, but unmistakable, a slow drag of something across the attic floorboards. Not heavy enough to be furniture, not light enough to be a mouse. Something was moving up there. I told myself I wasn't going to check. No one ever hears a weird noise at night and actually wants to investigate. That's how you end up as the headline in a true crime podcast. But the thing about noises in the dark is they don't go away just because you decide to ignore them. In fact, they seem to get louder. Finally, I sat up, every movement exaggeratedly slow, as if the noise itself might notice me. I reached under the bed for the flashlight I kept there. The cool metal of its handle grounded me for just a second, like maybe I was holding on to something that could keep the darkness back. The hallway was colder than my bedroom, much colder. My bare feet hit the floorboards, and the shock of it traveled all the way up to my jaw. I try not to let the boards creak, but every step seemed to betray me, sending sharp little snaps into the silence. The attic pull cord hung from the ceiling at the far end of the hall, swaying ever so slightly, as if someone had brushed against it recently. I stopped under it, staring. I didn't pull it right away. I just stood there, the tapping still steady above me, my breath fogging faintly in the air. I realized I was counting 1, 2, 3, 4, in perfect sync with the taps, as if my body had unconsciously matched its rhythm. I gave the cord a firm tug. The attic ladder unfolded with a sound that made my teeth clench, the dry screech of old wood grinding against itself. The smell hit me before I even climbed a step. Dust, old insulation, and something else, faint, metallic like rust. Or blood. I told myself not to think about that. One hand gripping the flashlight, the other holding the railing, I climbed slowly. Each rung creaked under my weight, echoing up into the darkness above. My beam of light cut through the attic like a blade, but it wasn't enough. The shadows seemed to push back, swallowing everything just out of reach. The tapping had stopped, which should have been a relief. But instead, my heart hammered harder, because now there was nothing to locate it. I reached the top, stepping onto the dusty boards. The air was thick and unmoving, heavy in my lungs. My flashlight beam swept across boxes, old furniture draped in sheets, a tangle of cobwebs. Nothing moved, but then I noticed something strange. The dust. Every surface up here was coated in a thick, undisturbed layer, except for one narrow trail. It began at the far corner of the attic and ended right where I stood. It was as if something had been crawling toward me. I stepped back, heart thundering. That's when I saw it, just for a second. In the farthest shadow, low to the floor, something shifted. Not a scurry, not a flinch, more like a slow, deliberate repositioning, as though it didn't care if I saw it. The light from my flashlight wavered in my shaking hands, catching the brief glint of two eyes. They didn't shine like an animal's. No reflection from the beam. They were just dark. Too dark. I stumbled back onto the ladder, descending faster than I probably should have. Halfway down, I made the mistake of glancing up. The space where the eyes had been was now empty. Back in the hallway, I shoved the ladder closed so hard the frame rattled in the ceiling. My breathing was ragged, too loud in the empty house. I locked my bedroom door, sat on the bed, listened. No more tapping, no more dragging. But the cold stayed. It lingered, clinging to my skin as though I'd brought something back down with me. That was the last night I tried to investigate the noises. The next few days were quiet, almost eerily so. I didn't hear footsteps, no scratching, no breathing. And yet, the feeling never left, the sense that the silence itself was watching me. By the fifth night, I realized something horrifying. The quiet wasn't because it had gone. It was because it was waiting. By the sixth night, I had stopped pretending to sleep. I just lay there in the dark, staring at the faint glow of the alarm clock on my nightstand. My blankets felt heavier than they should have, pressing against me like a slow tide. The silence was so deep that I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. And yet, under that steady pulse, something else was there. Breathing. Not loud, not ragged, just a quiet, steady inhalation and exhalation, as if someone was in the room, trying not to be noticed. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. My eyes darted to the far corner, where the shadows pooled thickest. My flashlight was on the nightstand, inches from my hand, but I knew that if I reached for it, I'd make a sound. So I waited. The breathing continued, unchanging, a slow rhythm, perfectly patient. Whoever, whatever, it wasn't in a hurry. I lay there for what felt like hours, every muscle screaming to move. Finally, I took a risk. My hand slid across the sheets, fingers brushing the cold metal of the flashlight. I grabbed it, twisted toward the corner, and clicked it on. The beam hit nothing, just the corner, empty, undisturbed. But the breathing didn't stop. It was coming from behind me. I whipped around, shining the light toward the side of the bed. Still nothing. My own reflection in the mirror across the room stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed. And then, the mirror fogged. For a second, I thought it was my imagination. But no, the condensation spread slowly across the glass, as though someone was standing right in front of it, exhaling. There was no one there. I turned away, heart pounding so hard I felt in my teeth. The air in the room seemed heavier now, thick with something unseen. That's when I heard the floorboards outside my bedroom. A single step. I froze. Another step, closer this time. The kind of deliberate, weighty tread that told you someone was trying to be quiet, but not too quiet. Like they wanted you to know they were coming. My bedroom door creaked slightly in its frame, even though I had locked it. That's when I remembered the attic ladder. How hard I'd slammed it shut. The noise could have cracked the frame. And if the lock was broken, the doorknob turned. Not fast, not like in a panic, but with a slow, patient twist, as though whoever was on the other side wanted me to hear every click. I backed toward the far wall, flashlight beam shaking wildly. My legs hit the bed frame, but I didn't dare sit. The knob turned again, further this time, then stopped. The silence after was worse than the sound itself. I stared at the door until my eyes burned. And then, just when I thought maybe it was over, there came a sound I'll never forget. A whisper. Not words. Not exactly. Just the shape of them, low and curling, like they were being breathed directly into the crack under the door. My flashlight flickered. Once. Twice. Then went dark. I don't remember crossing the room. I just remember my hands fumbling with the lock, my feet hitting the hallway, my body running on pure instinct. I didn't stop until I was outside, barefoot on the cold lawn, my breath spilling out in white clouds. The house loomed behind me, its windows dark and watching. For a moment, nothing moved. And then, in the attic window, the shape shifted, just a fraction, just enough for me to know it was there. Waiting. That was the last night I stayed there. The next morning, I packed my things. I told the landlord I was leaving. No explanation. But even now, months later, I still wake up sometimes to the sound of breathing. And I'm starting to think, it wasn't the house.